my name is May Nelson, and this is my 20-minute presentation for my speech class in criminal justice. The case study I specifically chose, titled A Loving Father, is about a daughter accusing her father of sexually molesting her and her sister. In the beginning of the case study, it describes that the person investigating the issue is a small-town criminal investigator named Pete, who works for a small police department. One day, Pete gets a call from June, the Human Services social worker, saying that there's a serious case investigating a 15 and 11-year-old girl, both being sisters, accusing their father of sexual intercourse with them. As Pete arrives, he is advised by June that both of the girls are in the process of getting a court order to send the girls to protective custody at an emergency youth center until everything is sorted out. He then finds out that both of the girls told the school nurse that there are multiple instances that their father has been having sexual intercourse with them. And the nurse calls June, the social worker, and then June tells Pete, the criminal investigator. Eventually, these events have been going on for some time. For the older girl, or the older daughter, named Alice, who's 15, she's been having sexual intercourse with her father since she's 11, so for 4 years. And the younger daughter, whose name wasn't revealed, who's only 11, she's been having it very recently. When Pete finds out this information might very well be true because both of the girls' stories tend to match up after asking them personal questions separately, it's decided that they should get a video recording of their statements, again, separately, so that they can have that on file, possibly use that to prosecute the father. The father, whose name is Freddie Andrews, is a very upstanding person in the community. He's a teacher for the junior high, he's a choir leader, a Sunday school teacher, and he's involved in a youth group at their local church. The father and mother, when arriving, asked what was happening. They were very frantic. And eventually Pete tells Mr. and Mr. Allen of their constitutional rights, what exactly they're being accused of by their daughters, that they're accusing them of essentially rape, what violations he's under, and Mr. and Mrs. Allen are both very upset about this. They're shrieking, they're yelling, they're making claims that the father has not done any of this, and this could never happen to them. They claim that both the girls are mistaken and possibly that they're on drugs. And Pete advises to get a local attorney while he gathers information from the girls. And he learns, after talking from both of the girls, that the older sister, Alice, has only started reporting this because of the recent sexual intercourse with the younger sister. And she does this because she's very protective of her younger sister. Unfortunately, at this time, there's no physical evidence to support the girl's story, and it only comes really against their word against their father's. And in the case study, it says to keep in mind that there has been another incident where this has happened between a coach and a local schoolgirl cheerleaders, in which there was an investigation and there was accusations that he was also doing inappropriate sexual molesting against them. However, this turned out to be false. And though this was proven false and there were no accusations actually made against the coach, his reputation was tarnished for life, and no one ever really trusted him again in the community. So it's very important to keep in mind that, kids might say things that they don't mean or that they don't know, and that if these are true allegations, they really have to be backed up with proper evidence. So that's the dilemma within this case study. So has he really been molesting the father, his two girls, or are they playing a sick joke because they don't like their father? Are they not getting along with their father right now? And that's what Pete and the social worker, June, has to properly figure out. And the And there's also a matter of still interviewing the father and getting his side of the story. As far as the information from the case study goes, it just kind of ended when the father and the mother fled the police station in rage and everything, and there wasn't really any further follow-up with them as far as the case study story. So since it's kind of open-ended, I kind of made up my own ending. And so I chose to make up the ending as Mr. Allen goes home, he leaves, and eventually comes back with an attorney. In the meantime, the girls are properly interviewed separately, and they have the same answers, and they're on video, so it's all on record. And Pete decides to declare that these girls are both telling the truth, that their father is sexually molesting them, that he's technically raping them. So the next step is to bring this case to the judge. Meanwhile, the girls are being held in child protective services. Will there be in foster homes until the date of the trial? So, and up until then, Pete and June work with the girls to properly prepare them for the trial. Even though there isn't any physical evidence currently, they still do a rape kit because there could possibly be residual evidence over time. Since the father has been sexually molesting the older sister for 4 years, there should probably be some scarring or other physical evidence that can be shown over time. In the end, I found in my story, in my ending, that the father, Freddie Allen, would be guilty and he would spend up to 30 years in federal prison. And then, happy ending, the girls get adopted to a loving family because the court has ruled that the family is unfit to care for the children they're on. So personally, I believe that this story could be true because this happens a lot, unfortunately, throughout the world and the country. And it can happen among friends, strangers, any kind of acquaintance you have with one person. Oftentimes this goes unnoticed because of the situation between families and friends, because of the person's personal beliefs on the matter. Sometimes it can take years to come out, because as the victim, you can be threatened, or you can just think that it's not okay to talk about it based on what you personally believe in or your religious beliefs. Sometimes the victim is just basically scared just to tell anyone, or they're shamed in themselves or the situation, and so it just doesn't come out for many years, months, any amount of time until the victim thinks that they want to advocate for themselves and they want to tell someone about it. Or in some worse situations, it's been going on for so long that the attacker has manipulated the people and they make it seem normal to the victim. So I think in this kind of case, I would label it as domestic sexual assault. It's very, again, common in many parts of the world, even in Massachusetts, though I believe that there are many instances within the state and the country. I had trouble finding articles specifically in Massachusetts where this was happening. I think it's because the results are so specific that it's really hard to find another article that this matches to. I also think that a lot of this happens maybe in small towns, so it might be published in their local newspapers and it might just not be out to the world, and I just wouldn't have access to it. I did find a very general case in which there was just a 40-year-old man who's imprisoned for 40 years after raping 2 girls. In some ways it was similar to the case study because the girls were between the ages of 11 and 15 and the man had repeatedly raped them. The awful part about this is that he knew that he was doing an awful thing, and the only way that he was caught was because his girlfriend witnessed the rapings on a videotape on his phone, and then she reported it to the police. Also, when researching articles about domestic sexual assault, it was difficult to find, again, many articles that matched up. But coming across this, I found that an article titled "American Has an Incest Problem" by Mia Fonte stated that child sexual abuse impacts more Americans annually than cancer. So I found a lot of articles that kind of just brought the idea that sexual assault is a very prevalent thing in the country, even Massachusetts. And the article stated that 3 to 4 girls and 1 in 5 to 7 boys are sexually abused before they turn 18. And many of these tended to occur in the family. And the assaultants could come from anyone. They could come from their fathers, their stepfathers, uncles, cousins, etc., and vice versa for the female population. Because, as many people forget, both males and females do get sexually assaulted. And I think that a lot of times people forget that males get sexually assaulted because, again, it gets unreported because they're embarrassed, it diminishes their ego, etc. And according to this article, it pinpointed some specific reasons on why people don't always report this. Either because, and a lot of it was because the children might be protecting the adults. Or is it intentional or is it not intentional, would be the question. And this can go on for the child's entire life. Obviously, the longer it happens, the more psychological damage it will cause to the child. And it's really sad because oftentimes families know that this is going on and they just kind of push it aside and they go about their day. Example, the Jerry Sandusky in Pennsylvania, he was one of the side assistant coaches and he had actually adopted one of the boys that he trained for football camp, and he sexually molested him his whole life. So now to get into more of the legal definitions of sexual assault. In Massachusetts, I found that there is technically no crimes called dating violence or domestic violence. Instead, it's defined as abuse, which is the occurrence of one or more of the following between family or household members, and this includes attempting to cause or causing physical harm, placing another in fear of imminent serious physical harm, causing another to engage involuntarily in sexual relations by force, threat, or duress. And the family members who count as in the household are or were married to another, or were residing together in the same household, or were relating by blood or marriage, and there were many other things on the list. However, I didn't feel that to include them because they weren't relevant to the topic. So you can see that the abuse among household family members was very prevalent in this case study, so that's why I included to only include that information. And adding to the definitions of the legal definitions within Massachusetts, sexual assault is not a crime technically in Massachusetts. So instead it has to be labeled as incest, indecent, assault and battery, rape, or assault with intent to commit rape. And under the crimes of this, in this case, for the case study, it would be the father would be in violation of 13B, indecent assault and battery on a child under the age of 14. That would be the younger sister in this case. And 13H, indecent assault and battery on a person 14 or older, and that would be the older daughter in this case, Alice. And because the rapes were between the ages of 15 and 11 years old for the daughter, the father would be specifically in violation of 22A, rape of a child, defined as whoever has sexual intercourse or unnatural sexual intercourse with a child under 16 compels such child to submit by force against his will or compels such child to submit by threat of bodily injury. And all this terminology came from the Harvard University of Police, so I find that it's very reliable, and I wouldn't question any of the definitions that they came up with. Now, in this specific case, the suspect is Freddie and Alan, and He's found guilty by forcibly raping his child, so he would be imprisoned by the state for life or any amount of years that the judge rules necessary. And this can kind of depend on case to case. It won't always be 30, 40 years. After speaking with a guard who actually worked in a maximum security prison, he said that their sentences can be diminished by good behavior, things that they do inside the prison to help around, all sorts of things. But since both children are under the age of 16, there's no time limit to commence any type of legal proceedings against the perpetrator at this time. But since one of the victims is over 16, if they were over 16, then they would only have 15 years of this offense, according to Massachusetts. And in this instance, since Freddie Allen is a parent, he is able to have visitation rights terminated or limited upon the conviction of the sexual offense. And these can be either taken down by the victim themselves if they choose to do away with them, or they could be taken down by the guardian, but that's really up to them. And these can also, the limitations and terminations can last as long as the child or guardian wants. So in lay terms, this means that the victim requests the court limit or termination rights of the said parent. And in order for this to happen, there has to be a conviction of the rape to instill the limited or termination rights. So when suspected of a convicted crime that would lead to imprisonment or education, there must be a DNA sample done. And the DNA sample must be collected within 1 year of the allegation against said parent or whoever. And the DNA evidence must be present before the release of said personnel from custody. So that's just pretty much saying there has to be DNA evidence ready within 1 year after they get incarcerated, and it has to happen before they're in the custody of the state prison or whatever they're going to. And this will usually be collected by the Department of Corrections of the State Police, and it will be analyzed by them as well. So there's a long list of understanding, investigating, and responding to sexual assaults. This can take weeks, months, years, and obviously the longer it takes to collect the evidence, the longer it's going to take to prosecute that person. So in the investigation stage, every assault case is coded so that if you have to go back to it, it has its own code, it's easily available to find. And every report should have an assigned tracking number in writing, even if those elements don't meet them of a sexual offense. And simply just preserving this information makes it easy to return back if you need to identify it. There should be also no rush when reporting these. Things should be thorough and detailed, and you should take as much time as you need, because a false report would not be able to be used in court. It would just be seen as tainted, and there would also be no evidence. So that would not be good in that case. So when it comes to writing a report, the more detailed, the better. So the report helps to identify the on-scene evidence and documented details, and overcome consent challenges, and help refresh memories of court testimony. So if you have more details, you're able to think on someone's memory. It won't be as vague, and also that will be in favor of the jury and the judge. It will be more believable, other than just vague things that would just be able to be manifested in any way. So it makes it more valid. So the greater level of detail, the better it helps the prosecution. And so in the report, you want to gather feelings from the perpetrator and the victim. What were they feeling? Was there any coercion? Was there any cover about anything? Do they remember things such as smell and taste in the event of anything happening? This is important because it helps pinpoint all the events, and it also helps investigators collect evidence. And it's important to note their physique when you're interviewing them. Are they calm and collected, or are they having a very fidgety time? Are they nervous? Are they biting their fingernails? This can give away whether they're telling the truth or not. Also, you have to note whether they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which is very important because it makes their statement valid or not. So for investigating, it's important for everything to be documented. It should be clear, and it all should be consensual, because if it's not consensual, then it can't be valid and it can't be used in court. And this should all be clear by your statements, your tone of voice. There should be no confusion when there's investigation going on. And when interviewing, it's key to realize that this process might be difficult for both the victim and the officer. This is a lot of pressure for the officer, and it's very traumatic sometimes for the victim to relay this information and go back to the event. So building a rapport with the victim is very, very essential because it helps the investigation go more smoothly. And also, it's important to be clear with the victim because a lot of times they don't understand the criminal justice system and why things happen, so it's important to explain every step of the process. And also, if they would like to seek any outside source for help, like a friend or family member, they're more than willing to do so. And so, in doing this, sometimes support is helpful because the event can be very traumatic, and sometimes people react in all different ways, like being quiet, or they can be very emotional. Sometimes being normal is how people react in these situations, and that's perfectly fine. Any way that they react is acceptable. And sometimes it's hard to build a rapport with them because oftentimes people who have a traumatic experience don't ever want to talk about it again. So sometimes it's important to get that information right away when they're willing to talk about it, so you don't have to go back and have them relive it. And also, not important for the investigation results, but sometimes you can have them, the victim, get a forensic exam so they can be tested for STDs or HIV and such. And they have the right to refuse this or accept it, whether they choose. Now, during the interrogation aspect of this, it's essential to get as much information in detail out of the victim as possible. And focus should remain on the suspect and not the victim in this case, because you want to know what the suspect was doing at this time, because you already kind of gathered information from the victim. And sometimes some strategies I learned from talking to some people from law enforcement, sometimes it's good to come in and have them think that you know more than they do. Have them think, oh, we have you on tape, and this is what we have, and we know you're guilty, we know you're wrong, and you just kind of put some false evidence in front of them. It could be like a fake CD or a fake report or something like that, and it will get them to give their true side of the story or plead guilty in this case if they were. So that's just one tactic of it. Another one is talking to them casually. Sometimes they feel guilty enough and they'll just get it off their chest. You could be like, oh, I know what you did is wrong. I don't know what you were thinking that day. Why'd you do it? And they just come out and say the truth in that case. And that's another tactic in the interviewing process in order to get information out of the suspect. So some specific statistics from Massachusetts regarding sexual violence are that nearly 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men have ever experienced some kind of sexual violence in their lifetime, other than rape. And that's a lot, half women and a quarter of men. And more than 1 in 7 women have experienced rape, and 2,337 unduplicated incidents of sexual assault were reported to a rape crisis center in Massachusetts in only 1 year, between July 2011 and June 2012. So that's a lot just in 1 year. Now, in general, these are just general sexual assault statistics in Massachusetts. You could get more specific from town to town. I also found some statistics about incest in Massachusetts, and Merriam-Webster defined incest as sexual intercourse between persons so closely related that they are forbidden by law to marry. For example, this can include a grandmother, grandfather, father, mother, daughter, cousins, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts. You could go down the list. So in general, the incest in Massachusetts, after scanning the county information and the city information about all the victims' ages of incest were about 15 years of age, and it most commonly occurred in the early mornings, usually 4 a.m., and it usually occurred in the homes, and most of the time they had personal weapons, including the hands, the feet, mouth, teeth, are used against the victim. And in Massachusetts specifically, there were the average age of the victim was from 2 to 23, and sometimes it would happen between 2 and 8 p.m., more generally. Lastly, after speaking with members of law enforcement, I learned a little bit about the process of domestic sexual assault. So in the beginning, they would get a call, and whatever police officer would be on hand would go to the scene and build a report. And in this case, they would try and have the victim get a rape kit as soon as possible. If not, that's okay, but it makes it a little bit harder to build on evidence, and DNA evidence is very essential in these sexual assault cases. And after they build the evidence, they document absolutely everything. This information goes to the DA's office, and the DA's office kind of takes it from then on, and they build their own investigation. They talk to the child, and in this case of domestic sexual assault with adolescents, they would have a sane interview in which they have their own little room in the DA's office where they talk to the child. The child is completely aware of everything that's going on. They have the DA, who's a professional in talking to children, just build some they would personally get acquainted with the child, and they would become very informal with them, very comfortable with them. They wouldn't have any guardian present in this case, and this is the only time that they wouldn't. There might be a police officer in the room who specializes in sexual assault, and this would all be audio, video recorded, and the DA would ask such questions where it sounds very casual, but they'd gather information about if the child actually is being sexually assaulted, or if they're not, and like where they're being sexually assaulted, and who is it, and when it happens. And during this, especially with little children, they might have the child's color or play with blocks. Again, just something so the child can be very comfortable with them. And after speaking to some law enforcement personnel, I learned that the characteristics of molesters can greatly be on either sides of the spectrum. They can be very, very obvious, very creepy, the typical kind of molesters, or they can be very outstanding people in the community, the people that you kind of least suspect. And after much thought, after learning and investigating myself all this information about sexual assault, I would bring charges against the father, Freddie Allen. And in order to do this, I'd gather all this information from him, his wife, co-workers, anyone that was kind of in contact with the family, and I would ask them all very similar questions, especially the father. I would ask him the same question repeatedly, and I'd ask it in different ways to see if his answers matched up, and if they didn't, he would probably be lying, and then you kind of figure out what is he trying to cover up, and that's where you kind of try and find more evidence about that. And that is what I would do in this situation. I had a lot of fun just researching about this case study, and I think it's a very prevalent thing in the country, and I think it's very important to learn about how these cases undergo, since it is such a sensitive topic. Thank you.